At Oak Ridge Private Academy, nestled in the heart of Silicon Valley, Principal Robert Thompson stood at his office window, watching students file into the building on a crisp autumn morning. His perfectly pressed suit and meticulously organized desk reflected his approach to running the school. Everything had to be just so, especially the dress code he'd implemented last semester. Little did he know, his orderly world was about to be turned upside down by a new student who had enrolled under a different last name. The student's father had specifically requested that his son be treated like any other teenager, without the weight of his famous surname. That morning, a Tesla Model S pulled up to the school entrance. A tall, lanky 16-year-old boy stepped out, wearing a simple red baseball cap. The boy adjusted his backpack and walked toward the main entrance, blending in with the other students. His name was Alex, and he had just transferred from a private school in Texas. Principal Thompson noticed the new student's red hat from his window and immediately frowned. The school's dress code strictly prohibited any political messaging, and Thompson prided himself on maintaining what he called a neutral learning environment. He grabbed his clipboard and headed for the hallway, ready to enforce the rules that had earned Oak Ridge its reputation for excellence. As Alex walked through the corridor, other students whispered and pointed at him. Some recognized him despite his attempt to maintain a low profile, while others were simply curious about the new face. A few students pulled out their phones, snapping quick photos of the boy in the red hat. "Excuse me, young man," Principal Thompson called out, his voice echoing through the now quiet hallway. "We need to discuss your choice of headwear. Political statements of any kind are not permitted on school grounds." Alex turned around, his expression calm and curious. "Sir, I understand your concern, but it's just a hat. I'm wearing it because I like it, not to make any particular statement." The principal's face reddened slightly. "Nevertheless, the rules are clear. Remove the hat immediately, or I'll have to ask you to leave the premises. We can't make exceptions, even for new students." A small crowd had gathered, watching the exchange with intense interest. Among them was Mr. Chen, the physics teacher, who recognized Alex immediately and tried to catch Principal Thompson's attention, but the administrator was too focused on the situation at hand. "I'd prefer to keep it on, sir," Alex replied politely. "I've reviewed the school's dress code thoroughly, and it specifically prohibits explicit political messaging. This is simply a red hat." Principal Thompson's patience was wearing thin. "Don't play semantics with me, young man. That hat represents a political statement, and I won't have it in my school. Either remove it or leave." "Excuse me, young man," Principal Thompson called out, his voice echoing through the now quiet hallway. "We need to discuss your choice of headwear. Political statements of any kind are not permitted on school grounds." Alex turned around, his expression calm and curious. "Sir, I understand your concern, but it's just a hat. I'm wearing it because I like it, not to make any particular statement." The principal's face reddened slightly. "Nevertheless, the rules are clear. Remove the hat immediately, or I'll have to ask you to leave the premises. We can't make exceptions, even for new students." A small crowd had gathered, watching the exchange with intense interest. Among them was Mr. Chen, the physics teacher, who recognized Alex immediately and tried to catch Principal Thompson's attention, but the administrator was too focused on the situation at hand. "I'd prefer to keep it on, sir," Alex replied politely. "I've reviewed the school's dress code thoroughly, and it specifically prohibits explicit political messaging. This is simply a red hat." Principal Thompson's patience was wearing thin. "Don't play semantics with me, young man. That hat represents a political statement, and I won't have it in my school. Either remove it or leave." Alex stood his ground, remaining remarkably composed for a teenager facing down an authority figure. "With all due respect, sir, I believe we're having a misunderstanding. Perhaps we could discuss this in your office?" "There's nothing to discuss," Principal Thompson declared, his voice rising slightly. I'm expelling you effective immediately for insubordination and violation of school policy. Please leave the premises." The gathered students gasped collectively. Mr. Chen finally managed to push through the crowd. "Principal Thompson, I really think you should." "Not now, Mr. Chen," Thompson interrupted, holding up his hand. "I'm handling this situation." Just then, the school secretary, Mrs. Patel, came running down the hallway, her face pale. "Principal Thompson. I need to speak with you immediately. It's about the new student." "I'm in the middle of handling a disciplinary matter, Mrs. Patel," Thompson replied firmly. "But sir, you don't understand," Mrs. Patel insisted, her voice trembling slightly. "The student you're trying to expel, his father, he's..." "My father is the majority stakeholder of this academy," Alex finished quietly, not wanting to make a scene. "He purchased it through an educational investment fund last month. But I really wanted to be treated like any other student, which is why I enrolled under my mother's maiden name." The color drained from Principal Thompson's face as the realization hit him. The mysterious educational investment fund that had acquired the school, the one he'd been meaning to research further, belonged to none other than the boy's father, one of the world's most famous entrepreneurs. A pin drop could have been heard in the hallway as students and teachers alike held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Principal Thompson's clipboard slipped from his fingers, clattering to the floor in the silent corridor. "I think now might be a good time for that discussion in your office," Alex suggested gently, showing remarkable maturity for his age. "Not because of who my father is, but because jumping to conclusions without proper dialogue doesn't benefit anyone." Principal Thompson nodded numbly, gesturing toward his office. As they walked away from the crowd, students began furiously typing on their phones, sharing what they'd just witnessed. The story would undoubtedly be all over social media within minutes. In the principal's office, Alex took off his hat and placed it on the desk between them. "Mr. Thompson, I chose this school because of its excellent academic reputation and its commitment to treating all students equally. I'd like to continue my education here, but I also believe we need to address the assumption that wearing a red hat automatically implies a political statement." Thompson sat heavily in his chair, his earlier authority deflated but not entirely gone. I may have acted hastily," he admitted, looking at the simple red hat that had caused such a commotion. Upon closer inspection, it didn't even have any writing on it, it was just a plain red baseball cap. "We all make mistakes," Alex replied. "What matters is how we learn from them. Maybe this could be an opportunity to review some policies that might be based more on assumptions than facts." The irony wasn't lost on Principal Thompson. He'd been so focused on maintaining order and preventing political discord that he'd created exactly the kind of situation he'd been trying to avoid. Moreover, he'd nearly expelled the son of the school's owner over a plain red hat that didn't actually violate any school policies. As the first period bell rang, Principal Thompson realized this would be a day of significant changes at Oak Ridge Academy, not because of who Alex's father was, but because sometimes it takes an unexpected situation to realize that rules should be based on reality rather than assumptions. The story of what happened that morning would indeed spread throughout the school community, but not in the way anyone expected. Instead of a tale about privilege and power, it became a lesson about prejudice, assumptions, and the importance of open dialogue. Alex would go on to become just another student at Oak Ridge, which was all he'd wanted in the first place. And the red hat? It found a permanent home on Principal Thompson's desk, serving as a daily reminder that sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected situations. The following day at Oak Ridge Private Academy buzzed with excitement and whispers. News of the incident had spread far beyond the school walls, though not quite in the way everyone expected. Instead of focusing on the confrontation, most students were talking about Alex's graceful handling of the situation and his genuine desire to be treated like any other student. Principal Thompson arrived earlier than usual that morning, his thoughts heavy with reflection. He'd spent most of the night reading through the school's policies, realizing how many of them were based on reactionary decisions rather than thoughtful consideration. The red hat still sat on his desk, a humble reminder of yesterday's events. As he walked through the halls, he noticed students quickly averting their eyes or suddenly becoming very interested in their lockers. The whispers followed him like a shadow. "That's him," they'd say, the principal who almost expelled the new kid. But what bothered him most wasn't the gossip, it was the realization that he'd failed to live up to the very standards of fairness and objectivity that he'd always preached. Meanwhile, Alex arrived at school in the same Tesla, this time without any hat. As he stepped out, a small group of students approached him, led by Raj, the student body president. "Hey, we were wondering if you'd like to join us for lunch?" Raj asked, trying to sound casual despite his obvious nervousness. Alex smiled warmly. "I'd love to, thanks. Just, can we skip the whole, who my dad is conversation? I'd rather talk about normal stuff, like how brutal Mr. Chen's physics homework is." The group laughed, tension melting away. "Oh man, you've already experienced the infamous Chen challenges?" Raj grinned. "Wait until you see his pop quizzes." Inside his office, Principal Thompson was meeting with the school's administrative team. Mrs. Patel had brought coffee for everyone, sensing they'd need it for what was about to be a lengthy discussion about school policies. "I've been thinking," Thompson began, fingers drumming nervously on his desk. "Yesterday's incident made me realize something important. We've been so focused on avoiding conflict that we've actually been creating it. Our dress code policy, for instance, has 17 pages of restrictions, but how many of them actually serve a meaningful purpose?" The administrative team exchanged glances. This was a side of Principal Thompson they'd never seen before, reflective, self-critical, and open to change. Usually, he was the one shutting down suggestions for policy modifications. In the hallway, Alex was navigating his way to his first class when he overheard two teachers discussing yesterday's events. "I heard the board of directors is meeting today," one whispered. "They say Thompson's job might be in jeopardy." Alex stopped in his tracks. This wasn't what he'd wanted at all. He pulled out his phone and quickly texted his father, "Dad, we need to talk about the school situation. Can you call me during lunch?" During third period, something unexpected happened. In Mr. Chen's physics class, Alex raised his hand to answer a particularly challenging question about quantum mechanics. Instead of giving him special treatment, Mr. Chen grilled him just as hard as he did every other student, making him explain his reasoning step by step. After class, Alex stayed behind. "Thanks, Mr. Chen, for treating me normally." The physics teacher smiled. "Physics doesn't care who your father is. Either you understand the concepts, or you don't. Simple as that." At lunch, Alex sat with Raj and his friends in the cafeteria. They were in the middle of a heated debate about the latest video game when Alex's phone rang. Excusing himself, he stepped into the empty hallway to take his father's call. "Dad, I need you to do something for me," Alex said immediately. "I heard rumors that Principal Thompson might lose his job. We can't let that happen." His father's voice crackled through the speaker. "Son, his behavior yesterday was completely unprofessional. The board has concerns." "But don't you see?" Alex interrupted. "This is exactly why I wanted to attend school normally. Yesterday wasn't about him being unfair to your son, it was about him treating me exactly the same as he would treat any other student. That's rare, Dad. And now he's actually trying to make changes for the better." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, his father spoke. "You know, sometimes I forget how grown-up you've become. I'll talk to the board." By the end of the school day, Principal Thompson was called into an emergency board meeting. He walked in with his resignation letter in his pocket, ready to face the consequences of his actions. However, what happened next would surprise everyone. Instead of a termination notice, the board presented him with a challenge: work with a student committee to revise and modernize the school's policies. The goal wasn't to eliminate rules, but to make them more reasonable and inclusive. "We believe," the board chairman stated, reading from a memo that had just arrived from the majority stakeholder, "that the true measure of leadership isn't never making mistakes, but how we learn and grow from them." Thompson sat there, stunned. He'd expected to lose his job. Instead, he was being given an opportunity to make real, meaningful changes. As he left the meeting, he saw Alex waiting in the hallway. "I hear you're going to be working on policy changes," Alex said, hands in his pockets. "Any chance you could use some student input?" Thompson smiled, probably his first genuine smile in days. "Actually, I think that's exactly what this school needs. But I have to ask, why did you help save my job?" Alex shrugged. "Because yesterday, you showed everyone exactly what this school needed to learn." Sometimes the best teachers are the ones who aren't afraid to learn themselves. As they walked down the hallway together, students and teachers watched in amazement. Something had fundamentally changed at Oak Ridge Academy. The walls that had separated administration from students, rules from reason, and authority from understanding were beginning to crumble. And somewhere in Principal Thompson's office, a simple red hat continued to sit on his desk, no longer a symbol of conflict, but a reminder that the best lessons often come from our biggest mistakes. The next few weeks at Oak Ridge Academy brought changes that nobody had expected. The Student-Faculty Committee for Policy Revision, now nicknamed the Red Hat Committee by the student body, had begun meeting regularly in the school library. Principal Thompson insisted on holding these meetings in an open space where any student could observe and contribute. Alex had taken a seat at the committee not as the owner's son, but as one of 12 randomly selected student representatives. The selection process itself had been his idea, names drawn from a digital lottery where any interested student could participate. This approach had earned him even more respect among his peers. "Our dress code shouldn't be about control," said Nina, a sophomore representative, during one particularly heated discussion. "It should be about creating an environment where everyone can learn comfortably." She had been one of the quietest students in school, but the committee had given her a voice she never knew she had. Principal Thompson sat at these meetings not as an authority figure, but as an equal participant. He'd started wearing more casual clothes on committee days, trading his usual suit for a sweater and slacks. The change in his appearance reflected a deeper transformation in his leadership style. One morning, as students filed into first period, they noticed something different about the school's entrance. The giant rule board that had greeted them every day with its list of don'ts had been replaced with a simple message: "Welcome to Oak Ridge Academy, where we learn together." In Mr. Chen's physics class, Alex was thriving, but not because of his name. He'd formed a study group that met during lunch breaks, helping fellow students understand complex concepts. Mr. Chen would often walk past the group, hiding his proud smile as he heard Alex explaining quantum mechanics with the same passion he brought to everything else. "You know," Raj said during one of these study sessions, "when you first came here, we all thought you'd be this entitled rich kid. Shows how wrong assumptions can be." Alex looked up from the physics problem he was solving. "That's exactly why I wanted to come here without using my dad's name. People see the name, and they stop seeing the person." The story of Oak Ridge's transformation had started spreading to other schools in the area. Principal Thompson began receiving calls from other administrators, curious about the changes taking place. Some were skeptical, others intrigued, but all were watching closely. One day, a local newspaper reporter showed up at the school, hoping to write a story about the tech billionaire's son who changed a school. Principal Thompson met her in the parking lot before she could enter the building. "You're welcome to write about our school," he said firmly, "but this isn't a story about one student or one incident. It's about an entire community learning to think differently." Inside the school, the changes were becoming more apparent each day. The cafeteria no longer had assigned seating sections. The library had been rearranged to create more collaborative spaces. Even the teacher's lounge had been open to students during certain hours, creating informal mentoring opportunities. Mrs. Patel, who had witnessed the famous Red Hat incident from the beginning, noticed another significant change. Students were starting to drop by Principal Thompson's office not because they were in trouble, but because they wanted to share ideas or concerns. "It's like we're running a completely different school," she mentioned during a staff meeting. "Yesterday, I saw a freshman walk straight up to Principal Thompson to discuss an idea for a new recycling program. 6 months ago, that would have been unthinkable." The red hat still sat on Principal Thompson's desk, but it had gained some company. Next to it stood a suggestion box that students had designed in art class. The box was emptied and reviewed weekly during committee meetings, with every suggestion given serious consideration. One afternoon, Alex's father made an unannounced visit to the school. He walked the halls quietly, observing the changes that had taken place since that fateful morning. He found his son in the library, deeply engaged in explaining a math concept to a group of freshmen. "Dad?" Alex noticed him standing there. "Is everything okay?" His father smiled. "More than okay. I came to see if my investment was worth it. I think it's paying off in ways I never expected." Later that day, Principal Thompson received an email from the board. The school's enrollment applications for the next year had doubled. But more surprisingly, the school had received recognition from an Educational Innovation Foundation for its progressive approach to student engagement. During the last committee meeting of the month, someone raised an interesting question: should we keep calling ourselves the Red Hat Committee now that we've moved so far beyond that incident? Principal Thompson looked at the red hat on his desk, then at Alex, who was doodling physics diagrams in his notebook. "I think we should," he said. "Not because of what the hat represented then, but because of what it taught us. Sometimes the most powerful changes start with the smallest misunderstandings." As students left school that afternoon, there was a different energy in the air. The rigid, rule-bound institution that had existed just a month ago was transforming into something new, a place where learning wasn't just about memorizing facts and following rules, but about growing together as a community. Alex walked to his car, stopping to chat with classmates along the way. He no longer felt like the new kid or the owner's son. He was just Alex, the physics enthusiast who happened to help spark a change that no one had seen coming. And somewhere in Silicon Valley, other schools were beginning to take notice. The story of Oak Ridge Academy was becoming more than just a viral moment about a principal and a red hat. It was becoming a lesson in how education could adapt and evolve when people were willing to learn from their mistakes and listen to each other. The sun set on another day at Oak Ridge, casting long shadows across the parking lot where it had all begun. Principal Thompson stood at his office window, just as he had done that fateful morning, but this time he wasn't looking for rule breakers. He was watching a community of students and teachers walking out together, engaged in conversations that would have never happened just a few weeks ago. As winter approached Oak Ridge Academy, the changes that had begun with a simple red hat were blossoming into something extraordinary. The school's transformation had caught the attention of educational experts across the country, and one morning, Principal Thompson received an unexpected email invitation to speak at a national education conference. He sat in his office, staring at the invitation with mixed emotions. Public speaking had never been his strong suit. He was much more comfortable enforcing rules than explaining how he'd learned to break free from them. The red hat on his desk seemed to mock him slightly, reminding him of how far he'd come from being the rigid administrator he once was. Meanwhile, Alex was facing his own challenges. Despite his efforts to maintain a low profile, a popular educational blog had somehow discovered his identity and published a detailed article about the tech era revolutionizing private education. The story had gone viral overnight. "I hate this," Alex confided to Raj during their lunch break. They were sitting in the newly redesigned courtyard, where students had planted a small garden as part of the school's new environmental initiative. They're making it sound like I'm some kind of educational messiah. All I did was wear a hat and stand up for what I thought was right." Raj took a bite of his sandwich, considering his words carefully. "Maybe that's exactly why this story matters. You didn't use your dad's name or money to force changes. You just acted like a regular person who wanted things to be better." The article had brought unexpected attention to Oak Ridge. News vans started appearing outside the school gates, hoping to catch interviews with students or staff. Principal Thompson had to send out a memo requesting that all media inquiries be directed through proper channels. One morning, during a particularly busy committee meeting, Alex raised his hand with an unusual suggestion. "What if we used all this attention for something good?" he proposed. "Instead of hiding from it, we could share what we've learned with other schools." The committee room fell silent. Mrs. Patel, who had been taking minutes, stopped typing and looked up with interest. Principal Thompson leaned forward in his chair, intrigued by the idea. "What exactly are you suggesting?" he asked. "Well," Alex continued, gaining confidence as he spoke, "we've made real changes here. Not just surface-level stuff, but actual meaningful improvements in how a school can operate. Maybe we could create some kind of educational toolkit, something other schools could use to start their own transformation." The idea caught fire immediately. Over the next few weeks, students and teachers worked together to document their journey. They collected stories, gathered data on improved student engagement, and compiled lessons learned from their policy revisions. Principal Thompson found himself staying late at school most evenings, working with various teams to capture the essence of what made their changes successful. One night, as he was reviewing some documentation, he heard a knock on his office door. It was Alex's father, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need this," he said, placing 1 cup on the desk next to the red hat. "My son tells me you're planning to share your model with other schools." Thompson accepted the coffee gratefully. "It wasn't my idea, actually. Your son suggested it. He thought we shouldn't keep what we've learned to ourselves." Alex's father smiled, taking a seat. "You know, when I bought this school, I thought I was just making another investment. I never expected it to become a laboratory for educational innovation." "Neither did I," Thompson admitted. "I was so focused on maintaining order that I forgot what education is really about: growth, discovery, and learning from our mistakes." The following week, Principal Thompson faced his fear of public speaking by presenting at a local educational conference. His hands shook as he approached the podium, but when he began speaking about Oak Ridge's journey, his nervousness faded. He shared stories about the Red Hat incident, the formation of the student committee, and the unexpected ways their changes had improved both academic performance and student well-being. Back at school, Alex was dealing with his own form of attention. A group of students from a nearby public school had reached out through social media, asking if they could visit Oak Ridge to learn about the changes firsthand. After discussing it with the committee, they decided to host an open house. The event was scheduled for a Saturday, and to everyone's surprise, over 200 students and educators from various schools showed up. The Oak Ridge Student Committee led tours, explained their new policies, and shared their experiences openly. During one of these tours, a visiting teacher asked Alex why he hadn't used his father's influence to simply force the changes he wanted. Alex's response would later be quoted in several educational journals, "Because real change doesn't come from forcing people to do things differently. It comes from helping them want to do things differently." Principal Thompson watched the interactions from his office window, the red hat still sitting on his desk where it had stayed since that first day. Mrs. Patel appeared at his door with a stack of emails from other schools requesting information about their policy revision process. "Did you ever imagine," she asked, "that a disagreement over a hat would lead to all this?" Thompson shook his head, smiling. "You know what the funny thing is? That hat wasn't even what everyone thought it was. It was just a red hat. We all saw what we wanted to see in it. As winter settled in, Oak Ridge Academy had become more than just another private school in Silicon Valley. It had become a model for how education could adapt to modern times while maintaining academic excellence. The students walked the halls with a sense of ownership and pride, knowing they were part of something special. And somewhere in Principal Thompson's office, a simple red hat continued to sit on his desk, no longer a symbol of conflict or change, but a reminder that sometimes the best lessons come from being willing to see things differently. The story of Oak Ridge Academy was far from over, but it had already taught everyone involved a valuable lesson. True education isn't just about rules and regulations, it's about creating an environment where everyone has the opportunity to grow, learn, and contribute to something bigger than themselves. Spring arrived at Oak Ridge Academy, bringing with it an unexpected announcement. The school had been nominated for the National Innovation in Education Award, a prestigious recognition that typically went to much larger institutions. The nomination had come from an anonymous source, though most suspected it was another school that had successfully implemented Oak Ridge's new educational model. Principal Thompson stood in the morning assembly, his voice carrying across the auditorium with a confidence that would have seemed impossible just months ago. "This nomination," he explained, "isn't just about our school. It's about every single person in this room who had the courage to think differently about education." The students exchanged proud glances. They had all played a part in the transformation, from the smallest suggestion in the comment box to the major policy overhauls. Even the freshman class, who had entered Oak Ridge after most of the changes were implemented, had embraced and enhanced the new culture. Alex sat in the middle of the assembly, trying to blend in with his classmates. Despite his efforts to remain low-key, he had inadvertently become a symbol of positive change. Other students no longer saw him as the tech billionaire's son, but as the catalyst who had helped them find their voice. After the assembly, a group of students gathered in the courtyard to discuss an idea that had been brewing for weeks. They wanted to create a student-run podcast about educational reform, sharing their experiences with other schools across the country. "We could call it Beyond the Red Hat," suggested Raj, who had become one of the school's most active voices for change. "It's not just about telling our story, it's about helping other schools find their own path to positive change." The idea quickly gained traction. Students from various grades volunteered to help, each bringing their unique perspectives and experiences. Even some of the initially skeptical teachers offered to participate, seeing it as an opportunity to bridge the gap between educators and students. Principal Thompson, walking past the group, overheard their discussion and smiled. Just a year ago, he would have immediately shut down any student-led media initiative. Now, he found himself wondering how the administration could support their effort while letting the students maintain creative control. Meanwhile, Alex's father had been keeping a low profile, watching the school's transformation from afar. One afternoon, he received a call from another tech industry leader who was interested in implementing similar changes in schools across the country. "The beautiful thing about what happened at Oak Ridge," Alex's father explained, "is that it wasn't driven by money or influence. It came from students and educators working together to create meaningful change." In Mr. Chen's physics class, the impact of the school's transformation was particularly evident. The rigid seating arrangement had been replaced by flexible learning spaces where students could collaborate on complex problems. Test scores hadn't just maintained their previous high standards, they had improved. It turns out, Mr. Chen commented during a faculty meeting, that when students feel ownership of their education, they're more motivated to excel. Who would have thought? The irony in his voice made everyone chuckle, remembering how skeptical some teachers had been initially. One morning, as spring flowers bloomed in the school garden, a surprising visitor arrived at Oak Ridge. It was the principal from the nearby public school, hoping to learn more about the changes that had made Oak Ridge a model of educational innovation. Principal Thompson welcomed her into his office, where the red hat still held its place of honor on his desk. "Would you believe," he asked, gesturing to the hat, "that this simple piece of clothing changed everything?" The visiting principal smiled. Sometimes the smallest things create the biggest changes. But from what I've heard, it wasn't really about the hat, was it? Thompson shook his head. No, it was about learning to see beyond our preconceptions. The hat was just the beginning. As they toured the school, they passed Alex's study group in the library. He was helping a struggling student understand a difficult concept, showing the same patience and dedication that had characterized his approach to changing the school's culture. The visiting principal watched the interaction with interest. You know, she said quietly to Thompson, when I first heard this story, I thought it was about privilege and power. But being here, seeing this, it's about something much more important, isn't it? Thompson nodded. It's about realizing that true education isn't about control, it's about growth. And sometimes, the people we think need to learn the most are actually our greatest teachers. Later that day, during a Red Hat committee meeting, someone raised an important question: what would happen to all these changes once the current students graduated? How could they ensure that the spirit of innovation and collaboration would continue? Alex, who had been quietly taking notes, spoke up. Maybe that's our next challenge. Not just making changes, but creating a culture that keeps evolving long after we're gone. The committee spent the rest of the meeting discussing ways to institutionalize their improvements while keeping them flexible enough to adapt to future needs. They called it the Living Legacy Project, an initiative to ensure that future generations of Oak Ridge students would have the same opportunity to shape their educational experience. As the day drew to a close, Principal Thompson stood at his familiar spot by the office window. The scene below had changed dramatically from a year ago. Instead of hurrying to their cars, students and teachers lingered in the courtyard, engaged in discussions that blended learning with life. The red hat on his desk caught the afternoon sunlight, casting a soft shadow. Thompson picked it up, turning it over in his hands, marveling at how such a simple object had sparked such profound changes. But he knew it had never really been about the hat. It had been about the courage to question assumptions, the wisdom to learn from mistakes, and the willingness to see beyond the surface of things. Outside, Alex was walking to his car, surrounded by friends who saw him not as an heir to a tech fortune, but as a fellow student who had helped them find their voice. The story of Oak Ridge Academy was still being written, but its message was already clear. Real change doesn't come from power or privilege. It comes from people willing to stand up for what they believe in, even if they're wearing nothing more remarkable than a simple red hat. As summer approached, Oak Ridge Academy was buzzing with excitement over their upcoming presentation at the National Education Innovation Conference in Chicago. The school had been selected as a keynote presenter, and rather than having just Principal Thompson speak, the committee had decided to send a diverse group of students and teachers to share their story. The selection process for the presentation team had been characteristic of the new Oak Ridge way: transparent, inclusive, and democratic. Students from all grades were encouraged to apply, and the final group was chosen through a combination of peer nominations and faculty recommendations. Alex had initially hesitated to apply, worried that his presence might overshadow the school's message. During a quiet moment in the library, he shared his concerns with Principal Thompson. "I'm thinking of stepping back from the Chicago presentation," he said, fidgeting with his physics textbook. "The media always makes it about me and my dad. This should be about Oak Ridge, not about us." Principal Thompson leaned back in his chair, studying the young man before him. "You know, Alex, there's something I've learned this year. Sometimes hiding from who we are isn't the answer. It's about how we use who we are to make a difference." Mrs. Patel, who was organizing the conference materials nearby, couldn't help but join the conversation. "Remember when you first came here? You wanted to be treated like any other student. And you were, right up until you stood up for what you believed in. That's what made the difference, not your last name." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. A group of students was gathered around a laptop, watching a viral video from another school across the country. They had implemented their own version of the Red Hat Committee, adapting Oak Ridge's model to address their unique challenges. "Look at this," Raj called out excitedly. "They're using our framework, but they've added their own elements. They've created a student-teacher mentorship program where they switch roles for one day each month." The video spread quickly through the school, inspiring new discussions about how Oak Ridge could continue to evolve. The upcoming conference presentation was no longer just about sharing their story, it was about being part of a larger movement in education. One afternoon, as the presentation team was practicing their speeches, Alex's father made another unexpected visit to the school. This time, he wasn't alone. He had brought several members of his company's educational foundation, along with representatives from other tech companies interested in supporting educational innovation. Principal Thompson welcomed them in the newly renovated Assembly Hall, where students were leading workshops on various aspects of the Oak Ridge model. The visitors watched in amazement as teenagers confidently explained concepts of educational policy and institutional change that many adults struggled to grasp. "The most remarkable thing," one visitor commented to Principal Thompson, "is how natural it all seems. These students aren't just following a new set of rules, they're actively shaping their educational experience." During the workshop sessions, a freshman stood up to share her story. She had transferred to Oak Ridge mid-year, after the changes had already taken place. "At my old school," she explained, "we were always told what to do and how to think. Here, we're asked what we think and how we can make things better." As the day progressed, Alex found himself leading a discussion about the importance of authentic student voice in education. Looking around the room, he realized something important. The story of Oak Ridge had grown far beyond the incident with the red hat. It had become a testament to what was possible when students and educators worked together as equals. The tech executives were clearly impressed, but one of them raised a critical question. "This is all very inspiring, but how do you maintain academic excellence while giving students so much freedom?" Mr. Chen stepped forward with a stack of data sheets. "Our test scores and college acceptance rates haven't just maintained, they've improved. When students are engaged in their education as active participants rather than passive recipients, they take ownership of their learning." Later that evening, as the visitors were leaving, Alex's father lingered behind to chat with his son. "You know, when I bought this school, I thought I was making a business investment. Instead, I witnessed an educational revolution." Alex smiled. "Dad, remember when you used to tell me that the best investments are the ones that create value beyond money? I think this might be what you meant." The next day, Principal Thompson called an emergency meeting of the Red Hat Committee. The Tech Foundation had offered to create a network of schools implementing the Oak Ridge model, with significant funding for teacher training and resource sharing. "Before we make any decisions," Thompson announced, "I want to hear from all of you. This could be a game changer for educational reform, but it has to stay true to our principles." The discussion that followed was thoughtful and nuanced. Students and teachers debated the pros and cons, considering how to scale their model without losing its essential character, the grassroots, collaborative spirit that had made it successful. As the sun set on another transformative day at Oak Ridge, Alex stood in the parking lot with Raj and several other committee members. They had spent hours discussing the future of their educational model, and despite the complexity of the challenges ahead, there was a sense of optimism in the air. "You know what's funny?" Raj mused, looking back at the school building. "All of this started because our principal jumped to conclusions about a hat. Now we're helping to reshape education across the country." Alex nodded, remembering that first morning that seemed so long ago. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest misunderstandings. But it's what you do after the misunderstanding that really matters. In Principal Thompson's office, the red hat still held its place of honor, but it had been joined by other symbols of the school's journey, student artwork, thank you notes from other schools, and pictures of the Oak Ridge community working together to create change. The story of Oak Ridge Academy was no longer just about a hat, a principal, or even a wealthy student. It had become a blueprint for educational transformation, proving that meaningful change was possible when people were willing to look beyond their assumptions and work together toward a common goal. The Chicago Educational Innovation Conference arrived sooner than anyone expected. The Oak Ridge delegation, a mix of students, teachers, and administrators, stood in the massive convention center, their presentation materials ready. Principal Thompson adjusted his tie nervously, while the students arranged their interactive displays. The conference hall was packed with educators, administrators, and policy makers from across the country. Many had heard about the Oak Ridge Revolution, but were skeptical about whether such changes could work in their own schools. Some dismissed it as a Silicon Valley anomaly, possible only because of the school's wealthy backing. Alex stood at the back of the Oak Ridge booth, helping set up the multimedia presentation. He had ultimately decided to participate, but insisted on being just one voice among many. The team had prepared a presentation that focused on the collaborative nature of their transformation, emphasizing that meaningful change could happen anywhere if people were willing to work together. 5 minutes until we're on, Mrs. Patel announced, checking her tablet. The team gathered for a final huddle, just as they had done so many times in the committee meetings back home. Principal Thompson looked at his team, students and teachers standing together as equals, and felt a surge of pride. "Remember," he said softly, "we're not here to tell them what to do. We're here to show them what's possible." The presentation began with Raj taking the stage. "A year ago," he started, "our school was like many of yours, focused on rules, rankings, and regulations. Then one morning, everything changed because of a simple red hat." The audience stirred with interest. Many had heard versions of the story, but hearing it firsthand was different. As each team member took turns speaking, they shared not just their successes, but also their struggles and failures along the way. Mr. Chen presented the academic data, showing how test scores and college acceptance rates had improved. But more importantly, he shared stories about how student engagement had transformed. "In my physics class," he explained, "I no longer have to force students to participate. They drive the discussions themselves." During the Q&A session, a public school principal from Detroit raised her hand. "This all sounds wonderful," she said, "but we don't have wealthy benefactors or cutting-edge technology. How can we possibly implement something like this?" Alex stepped forward to answer. "The truth is," he said, "none of our core changes required money. They required something more valuable, the willingness to listen to each other and the courage to try new things." As if to prove his point, several students from a small rural school in Georgia approached the booth later that day. They had already implemented their own version of the Red Hat Committee using nothing but dedication and creativity. Their principal, a warm-hearted woman in her 60s, had tears in her eyes as she described how it had transformed their school culture. During the lunch break, news spread through the conference about an unexpected development. The Department of Education had sent representatives to observe the Oak Ridge presentation, interested in studying their model for potential broader implementation. Principal Thompson found himself surrounded by fellow administrators, all eager to learn more. But instead of dominating the conversation, he kept redirecting questions to his students and teachers. "They're the ones who made it work," he explained. "I just had to learn to get out of their way." In the afternoon, Alex's father made a surprise appearance at the conference. But instead of taking the spotlight, he sat quietly in the back, watching as his son and the Oak Ridge team fielded questions about educational reform. "Your son has grown into quite a leader," Principal Thompson commented, sitting down next to him. "He has," his father agreed. "Though not in the way I expected. He's learned something I never could have taught him, how to use influence responsibly." As the day progressed, something unexpected began to happen. Other schools started sharing their own stories of change and innovation. The Oak Ridge presentation had opened a floodgate of discussions about how education could evolve. A group of students from a Chicago public school approached Alex during the afternoon break. They weren't interested in his family connections or wealth, they wanted to know how to start their own student-led reform movement. The first step, Alex told them, is to stop waiting for permission to make things better. Start small, be persistent, and most importantly, work with your teachers and administrators, not against them. Back at the Oak Ridge booth, Mrs. Patel was overwhelmed by the number of schools requesting copies of their policy documents and committee guidelines. We should create an online platform, she suggested, where schools can share their experiences and resources. The idea caught fire immediately. By the end of the conference, a network of schools had formed, committed to supporting each other in implementing positive changes. They called it the Red Hat Network, though many of them had never seen the actual hat that started it all. As the conference drew to a close, Principal Thompson stood on stage one last time. The red hat sat on the podium beside him. He had brought it along as a reminder of where their journey began. "This hat," he said, holding it up, "means something different now. It's no longer about a misunderstanding between a principal and a student. It's about the possibility of change in every school, every classroom, and every community." The audience rose in a standing ovation, not just for Oak Ridge, but for the promise of what education could become. As the team packed up their materials, tired but inspired, they knew their journey was far from over. "What happens now?" Raj asked, helping to dismantle their display. Alex looked around at the bustling conference hall, where dozens of conversations about educational reform were still going strong. "Now," he said, "we learn from everyone else, just like they learned from us. That's how real change works." On the flight back to California, Principal Thompson sat quietly, reviewing notes from the conference. The red hat was safely packed in his carry-on, but its influence had clearly spread far beyond one school in Silicon Valley. The story of Oak Ridge Academy had become something bigger, a catalyst for change in education across the country. And somewhere in that conference center, countless conversations were starting, all sparked by a simple misunderstanding about a red hat and the remarkable transformation it inspired. 1 year after the Chicago conference, Oak Ridge Academy hosted a special anniversary celebration. The campus was filled with visitors from across the country, educators, students, and administrators who had been inspired to create their own versions of the Red Hat Initiative. The school grounds had been transformed for the occasion. The once rigid hallways now displayed colorful murals painted by students, each telling a part of their ongoing story. The former Rules and Regulations board at the entrance had been replaced by an interactive digital wall where students could share ideas and inspiration. Principal Thompson stood at his familiar spot by the window, watching as buses arrived from various schools. The red hat still sat on his desk, though it had aged a bit, its color slightly faded from the sun. Next to it lay a stack of newspapers, all featuring stories about schools across the country that had undergone their own transformations. "Hard to believe it's been 2 years since that morning," Mrs. Patel said, entering with her tablet displaying the day's schedule. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you'd just ignored the hat that day." Thompson smiled. "Or if Alex had chosen a different color hat. Life's funny that way, isn't it?" The morning began with a series of student-led workshops. In the main hall, Raj, now a senior preparing for college, was leading a session on starting student-faculty committees. He had become something of a celebrity in the educational reform movement, having helped dozens of schools establish their own versions of the Red Hat Committee. Alex, who would also be graduating soon, moved through the crowds quietly. He had received acceptance letters from several prestigious universities, but what made him proudest was seeing how the movement had grown beyond him, beyond Oak Ridge, beyond even what they had imagined possible. Mr. Chen's physics classroom had become a model for interactive learning spaces. Gone were the rigid rows of desks, replaced by flexible seating and collaborative workstations. On this day, he was hosting a group of science teachers from across the country, showing them how student engagement had transformed his teaching approach. "The funny thing is," he explained to his colleagues, "I always thought maintaining discipline was the key to good teaching. Now I realize that when students are truly engaged, discipline takes care of itself. During lunch, a special ceremony was held in the courtyard. Schools from the Red Hat Network shared their stories of transformation. A small rural school in Montana had created a student-led environmental initiative. An inner-city school in Baltimore had developed a peer mentoring program that had significantly improved graduation rates. Alex's father attended the celebration, but like his son, he stayed in the background. He had learned that the best investments were the ones that grew on their own, powered by the passion and dedication of the people involved. Principal Thompson took the podium for what would be one of his last speeches as Oak Ridge's administrator. He had recently announced his retirement, feeling that the school was ready for fresh leadership. 2 years ago, he began, holding up the faded red hat, "I thought my job was to maintain order and enforce rules. Today, I understand that true education is about growing together, learning from our mistakes, and having the courage to see things differently." He announced that Oak Ridge would be establishing a scholarship fund, named not after any individual, but called simply the Red Hat Scholarship. It would support students who demonstrated a commitment to positive change in education, regardless of their academic standing or financial background. As the day drew to a close, Alex found himself sitting in the courtyard with Raj and several students from other schools. They were discussing the future of educational reform, sharing dreams and ideas that would have seemed impossible just 2 years ago. "You know what's amazing?" one student from Chicago said. "None of us are wearing red hats today, but we're all part of what it started." Later that evening, after most visitors had left, Principal Thompson sat in his office one last time. He picked up the red hat, now a piece of educational history, and smiled at the memory of that morning when he had been so certain about everything. Alex knocked on the open door. "Got a minute, Mr. Thompson?" "For you?" "Always," Thompson replied, gesturing to a chair. "I wanted to thank you," Alex said, "not for changing your mind that day, but for showing everyone that it's okay to learn and grow, no matter who you are." Thompson nodded, understanding the deeper meaning in Alex's words. "You know, when I retire next month, they want to put this hat in a display case in the main hall. What do you think about that?" Alex asked. "I told them no," Thompson replied. "This hat belongs on a desk, where it can remind whoever sits here that the best kind of leadership starts with being willing to learn." As the sun set on Oak Ridge Academy, casting long shadows across the campus, the story of the red hat had come full circle. What had begun as a confrontation between a principal and a student had grown into a movement that was changing education across the country. Alex walked to his car for one of the last times. Graduation was just weeks away. He paused to look back at the school building, remembering that first morning when he had walked in wearing a simple red hat, having no idea how much would change because of it. In Principal Thompson's office, the hat would remain on the desk until his last day, a reminder that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of misunderstanding. But it's what we learn from those moments that truly matters. The story of Oak Ridge Academy and the Red Hat would be told many times in the years to come, not as a tale of conflict or privilege, but as a reminder that real change is possible when people are willing to look past their assumptions and work together towards something better. And somewhere, in schools across the country, students and educators were starting their own journeys of transformation, each finding their own version of the red hat that would help them see education in a new light. The end wasn't really an end at all. It was just the beginning of countless new stories, all started because of a simple misunderstanding about a red hat and the courage to learn from it.